So, Chapter 21 will take us into the New Deal, and this is obviously coming out of FDR's election over Herbert Hoover. So, we're going to be learning a little bit more about the different programs or different aspects about the program, and we'll be talking about whether it was truly a success, if it was a moderate success, or if it was just kind of a flop. So let's take a look at, okay, so we got the election of 1932. This is what actually brings FDR into the White House. Hoover, by this time, as we had discussed in the previous module, has suffered from really a PR nightmare. He's ineffective in dealing with anything from the Great Depression. And FDR comes in kind of with a fresh approach, a new look. He's also pushing for a great deal of reform. And so people see a great deal of promise coming out of FDR. Granted, he is wealthy. He comes from a very prominent family, obviously related to Theodore Roosevelt. But the fact that he is kind of bringing in these all new ideas stimulates American interest. People are very interested in him, very interested in Eleanor, his wife, and they actually feel like there's something that can be done to help them. So one of the first things that FDR does coming into office is he wants to make kind of a big splash. So he does basically four different things. He declares a banking holiday, which means the banks are closed. The reason he does this is to prevent any additional runs on the bank. Obviously, banks didn't carry a great deal of money, at least not to cover everybody's deposits. So if you had 300 people show up at your branch to cash out their accounts, chances are you didn't have enough money on hand to be able to do that. And that was causing a great deal of problems, within the banking system. But he rushes through the Emergency Banking Act, which provided federal funds to reinforce the banks that were still open. He also gets passed the Glass-Steagall Act, which barred commercial banks from buying and selling stocks. So this was a way to prevent any more additional speculation that had kind of led to the Great Depression anyway. He also creates the Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation. And this is actually federal insurance money that will protect people's deposits. So if you have $100 in your checking account and $200 somewhere else, all of that was covered under FDIC. Of course, most people were, withdrawing $30,000, $40,000, whatever they would have, because they were fearful of the bank failing. If a bank failed and your deposits were in that bank, your deposits were gone. So if you can imagine, some of these people had little to nothing to live on, and they're trying to keep, what they have. The failure of a bank was really a very detrimental situation for them. Between 1929 and 1933, 5,000 banks failed. That's a third of all banks. By 1936, there were no bank failures that year. So obviously something was helping the situation that FDR kind of stepped in and did. He also removes the U.S. from the gold standard. And this means that the United States now has a little bit more control over the currency. So it's not directly tied to the price of gold anymore. It's a little bit more complicated than that. And of course, today we're completely off the gold standard anyway. But in those days, it was seen as a way to stabilize the economy. But when you're in a depression, commodities trading is very volatile, and certainly in this case, the price of gold had been fluctuating. So by doing this, FDR is trying to kind of stabilize the currency. Okay. So during the first 100 days, this is really kind of something that FDR plans out before coming into office. His goals are to restore the nation's hope, stabilize financial institutions, provide relief to the poor, and to create jobs, and to create a plan to regulate the economy. What he's trying to use initially is direct versus indirect relief. What he's trying to do is create indirect relief. The problem that they're running into, and this is what we talked about with Hoover, Hoover didn't believe that direct aid from the government to the American people was constitutionally correct or okay with the Constitution. So what FDR begins to use is the system that is already in place. So when the federal government was handing out money prior to this, they would go through state and local governments in order to fund money down to the local level. And so that's what he's doing. So it's indirect relief rather than the government cutting a check directly to an individual. Now, granted, that does happen. When you look at the AAA, and we'll talk more about that, that is an example of direct relief, where the federal government cuts a check to an individual. That's called direct relief. Indirect relief is passing it through an organization, such as a state or local government, and the government cuts the check. So there still is this kind of question whether or not this is constitutional or not. FDR had a very extensive set of advisory groups, even as he's running his campaign and campaigning prior to being elected president. Of course, he has Eleanor, who is very active in social causes. He has his official cabinet, which he basically handpicks people from different parts of the country. But he has what he calls the Brain Trust. And the Brain Trust were men who were obviously political advisors to Roosevelt during his presidency. They started off with professors of law from Columbia University. And they were really the ones that shaped the first New Deal. And I don't want to get in too much in depth with this, but suffice it to say that the Brain Trust were probably the best minds that FDR could find to help advise him on how to proceed from not just a constitutional standpoint, but from a legal standpoint in terms of the government laws and the legality of getting aid to the average American. He also had women. Frances Perkins is an example. She's the Secretary of Labor, which constituted the female Brain Trust. And FDR is one of the first presidents to really rely upon several key women, including Eleanor, for advisement. Frances Perkins started in New York City. She was very active in workers' rights, and she worked for the city and did a number of reforms in workers' working conditions. She was present at the Triangle Shirtwaist Fire, and so she saw what bad management and bad policy could do in terms of workers, and so she made it kind of her cause to get out there and improve working conditions and wages. And so she was kind of the ideal candidate for him for the Secretary of Treasury, or Commerce, or I'm sorry, Labor. God, Secretary of Labor. Jeez. Okay. The Black Cabinet is FDR's indirect group of advisors. And his main contact to these people was Eleanor. Eleanor was a very staunch believer in civil rights. And so she had a group of African Americans that she relied on to advise her on policies that affected African Americans. And this is the first time you have a president who really listens to African American leaders. Now, granted, you have to keep in mind that FDR is very particular about having this kind of image of him talking to African American leaders. So he's very discreet about it, and he uses Eleanor to communicate between the two of them. Because he's still at the same time really reliant upon Southern Democrats for support in Congress in order to get his New Deal programs passed. So he's very, very discreet about how much information is passed between himself and the Black cabinet. So one of the first programs that Roosevelt passes is the National Industrial Recovery Act. And this basically creates a National Recovery Administration, which was tasked with writing codes, which were basically government regulation instructions for different industries. So the codes for steel industry were different from the codes for lumber industry, for example, or food production. And what Roosevelt would do is they would go out, the White House would go out and look for people to write these codes. And normally they would approach people who worked within the industry. Chances are these people worked for the larger players within the industry, so they didn't go to mom and pop, steel refineries or what have you. They would go to large players like U.S. Steel and say, we need you to write this government regulation. The goal of this was to kind of stabilize the economy and also to encourage competition within the market. Doesn't really work that way, though, because these code writers are working for U.S. Steel. So who do you think they're going to support? U.S. Steel. So a lot of these codes don't have the intended benefit of increasing competition. Instead, they almost benefit the larger companies. So when I say in this slide, laissez-faire economy, really what they're doing is they're leaving it alone. They're trying to get, they're letting it be a regulated economy, so it's not really truly a laissez-faire, but they're writing regulations that are actually going to benefit the large companies rather than be detrimental to them. Roosevelt opposes the American shop or the open shop, and this increases what he calls industrial freedom. So the open shop allowed anybody to come into a position or to work within an industry. So let's say you're in the steel industry and you have never been a part of a union, then you could walk in and get a job. What Roosevelt does here is he ends that and says basically you need to be part of a union in order to get a job within the steel industry. And so they would have to join that particular labor union. And what this does is it encourages workers to become more involved in the process. As I've said, the codes aren't really written for this. They aren't encouraging workers. But what this does is it gets buy-in from the unions. And this is what FDR really needs. Because keep in mind, part of the Democratic coalition that he's got, the Democratic Party, their major supporters are union members. And so he needs their support in order to get a lot of the other New Deal programs passed. So the Federal Emergency Relief Administration forms in May of 1933. And again, how is the money disseminated? The money is being handed down through state and local governments. Again, he's not really passing out checks directly from the federal government to the workers yet. That will come. and a lot of people have problems with direct handouts, especially to unemployed, because it seems to be that they are not um, this fear that they will become addicted to government handouts, that they will not be able to survive without the government paying their way. Um, the goal of FERA is to alleviate household unemployment by creating unskilled jobs both in the local and state government. So encouraging, by funding this, what he's doing is he's funding the local and state governments, giving them money, and then they in turn will hire people to do, secretarial work, um, I don't know, anything that doesn't require a great deal of skill, but at least it's just getting people into work. In 1934, the city of Key West actually goes bankrupt, and the FERA comes in and actually takes control of the government of Key West. And it's largely seen as a success because a lot of what they do is they begin to funnel federal money in for infrastructure improvements like paving roads, building new bridges, getting people to work, essentially, is what they were trying to do. Within 2 years, the city is out of financial trouble, and it's focused on the tourism industry. And that was seen as really kind of a easy sell because it is Florida. People love to come down and travel and be tourists, but Key West was pretty much reinvigorated through the tourism industry. Probably seen as one of his biggest successes is the Civilian Conservation Corps, the CCC. And what's important about this, excuse me, is this target demographic is unmarried men between the ages of 18 and 25. What's important about this is when we take a look at World War II, this is the exact demographic that gets behind the Nazi Party, because these are men who are not getting married, but starting out on their own. They're creating their own families or creating their own kind of way in the world. And some of them are graduating college, and there are no jobs to be had. And so in Germany, these men are really the ones that are fueling the Nazi Party. And I'm not saying that this is exactly a direct correlation, but this is a smart move on Roosevelt's part to take this demographic and make sure that they are that they're getting jobs. And so basically what they're tasked to do is go around and work on civilian conservation projects like building parks, building cabins for state and federal parks. There are a number of different things that the CCC does. The men are all paid a wage of $30 a month, and $25 of that had to be sent home to the family. You also have camps for African American men, and they are segregated, they are not integrated. And in some cases, Native Americans. There were 2 in Florida for the Seminoles in South Florida, 2 separate camps for them. But the goal was to provide unskilled manual labor jobs related to conservation and development of natural resources in rural areas. And this was land that was owned by the federal, state, and local governments. You had over 3 million men participate in the CCC during its lifespan. And really what they were trying to do was to train these men for future jobs once the economy began to get going again. The Public Works Administration is kind of similar in the fact that it is focused on getting men, and really mostly men, but some women, back to work. And they undertook um, a number of large projects or public projects. So the Overseas Highway, when the Overseas Railroad is destroyed in the Labor Day hurricane, the federal government, actually the state of Florida, comes in and buys the Overseas Highway or the Overseas Railroad, what's left of it. And so the federal government comes in and provides the funds for the conversion of the railroad into a highway to Key West. The Triborough Bridge in New York City, Hoover Dam is an example. The Grand Coulee Dam becomes a big symbol of the New Deal projects. It's a big dam out west. Houston's airport, and then you have Greenbelt communities, which were like housing projects, but not. They're more like apartment complexes that are federally funded. And these were all major projects that were funded through the PWA, Public Works Administration. The goal was to spend about $3.3 billion in the first year, and $6 billion in all. And so you're talking about a great deal of money getting passed around. The TVA is another one of these projects that comes up. And really what they're trying to do here is create a ready source of electricity. And so this is the first large regional planning agency of the federal government, and it still is, if it's not the largest, it's one of the largest. And so the goal was to use the Tennessee River Valley, which was notorious for flooding, to build a series of dams, and all of these dams would provide electricity to the rural parts of the South. This is the deep, deep South. Incidentally, Oak Ridge, Tennessee, which is where a lot of the Manhattan Project, they did a lot of the work around the Manhattan Project, is in the heart of the Tennessee Valley. And it benefits from this electricity that is being produced in abundance. But by 1934, the TVA employed over 9,000 people. Because of the dams and the creation of these dams, you have over 150,000 people who are displaced from the region. And that sounds bad, and in some ways you can interpret it that way. But where are these people going to go? Probably into the cities or out of the rural areas. And so what they're trying to do is to bring electricity to modernize the South, and encourage industry, while at the same time encourage a little bit of forced urbanization, that people will get up and move out of these poor, rural communities that have little to anything available in the way of services. And so a lot of people, these 150,000 families, are moving to other areas of the South where hopefully they can find a job, and it will help encourage the economy of the South. And I mentioned that the AAA, the Agricultural Adjustment Act that was passed in May 1933. The precursor of this, if you remember, is the Agricultural Marketing Act under Hoover. It targets a number of commodities: wheat, cotton, field corn, rice, tobacco, milk, milk and its byproducts, and hogs. And then it adds a number of other commodities to it as well as it moves forward. What's interesting about this is basically farmers are being paid to not grow crops, to leave their fields barren or fallow. And what this is focusing on doing is decreasing the agricultural surplus, both within crops, and all of these crops are cash crops. You notice cotton is in here as well, but also livestock. So as we talked about before, Southerners had a hard time understanding supply and demand. And so, if their crops, if they had a bad season one year, what they would do instead of cutting the crop to increase demand, they would produce twice as much if they could. It was always about increasing the production in order to get more money, but that's not exactly how it worked. And so what the AAA tried to do is do a number of things, but one of the first things it tried to do was to educate the farmers on supply and demand, and how growing more and more food or cash crops did not necessarily mean more money in their pocket. A couple of other things that they did was the AAA tried to instill some soil conservation tactics and programs in order to teach farmers how to re-energize the soil and that sort of thing. So it had far-reaching applications, and in some cases, when it first rolled out, farmers were just horrified, because literally they would go into a warehouse, the federal agents would seize, cotton and burn the cotton, or burn the corn. And that seemed like such a waste to a lot of the farmers. But it also meant that the government agents would go out to the farm and they would slaughter cattle or slaughter pigs in large numbers. And for a farmer who, a pig is a big investment, or a cow is a big investment, this was seen as just horrifying. But of course, this was all under the guise of trying to kind of right the surpluses that existed within the South in terms of crops. Overall, tenant farmers and sharecroppers benefited from this. Landowners let the farmers and sharecroppers use the fallow land to plant crops for their own consumption. So they were actually able to grow their own crops for their own consumption, meaning their own family. So their diets were much better. And you also didn't have as many sharecroppers and tenant farmers escaping from the farm. In other words, they stayed put rather than, running off into the city. Larger farmers and food processors benefited mostly, while smaller farmers and sharecroppers often left for the city. Competition was tough. If you can imagine, for some of these farmers, losing these crops and losing livestock was a major investment and major. It was detrimental to their family's finances. And of course, in any case like this, larger corporations or larger individual farms would survive much better than the smaller farms. It's just the way it works. And lastly, the FHA, Federal Housing Administration, which is still around today, was created through the National Housing Act of 1934. It sets standards for construction and underwriting, as well as insuring loans made by banks and other private lenders for home building. So the goal was to improve housing standards and conditions, but also provide an adequate home financing system so that people could get insurance for mortgage loans. And hopefully through all of this, stabilize the mortgage market. What it ended up doing was increase the number of people who could afford a down payment on a house and the monthly debt service payments on a mortgage. So it increases the market for single-family residences. So this is seen as really a big success for FDR and for the New Deal, because it reinvigorates the housing market, which in turn reinvigorates other industries like the lumber industry and consumer goods. So what ends up happening is a number of FDR's programs are ruled unconstitutional by the Supreme Court. So what FDR ends up having to do is kind of backtrack and rewrite some of these programs to whether they are constitutional, and it takes a great deal of time. But he certainly is not happy about this, and we will see what ends up happening out of that. But keep in mind, his relations with the U.S. Supreme Court are not very good for most of his first term. So we have the second New Deal, which takes place after the 100 Days. And there's a very big difference between the first New Deal and the second New Deal. The first New Deal is action. It's based around action. Getting stuff done, getting people back to work, getting relief into the hands of the people, getting local and state governments money in order to get people working and get back to doing what they need to do. The second New Deal is a little bit more radical, and it brings with it a much larger federal government. And so keep in mind that prior to FDR, the federal government was relatively small. After the New Deal, the federal government probably triples or quadruples its size, which is kind of a job creator in and of itself, because it's bringing all of these young people to Washington, D.C. It's interesting, I was talking with a woman who retired from federal government, and she remembered coming to D.C. as a young lady to work in the New Deal, and she talked about how Washington during those days was so young. You had all of these young people walking around, literally right out of college, who were getting some really, really good jobs, good paying jobs in the federal government. And that was really the only way that you could get a really good job, was by getting involved in some sort of New Deal program. So the Works Progress Administration supersedes the work of the Federal Emergency Relief Administration. So this is a rewriting of the FERA program. And FDR divides it into different divisions. There's engineering, construction, professional and service projects, blah, 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 blah. All of these different divisions were tasked with different things to do. Again, ideally, what they're trying to do is they're trying to get people to back to work. One of the things that comes up, let's see if it's in here. I don't see it. The WPA's main mission is centered around the federal project number 1, which had a number of different projects. The Federal Art Project, the Federal Music Project, Federal Theater Project, Writers Project, and then Historical Records Survey. And one of the things that FDR tries to do is he tries to get people's mind off of the Depression. So he uses a number of different ways in order to get people to do that. And so he uses artists who, of course, when in the Depression, artists can't find work. And so the government begins to hire artists who are musicians or painters or writers, theater directors, in order to kind of get people to start thinking on other things other than the detriment in which they found themselves. So a number of things come up under the WPA. You have posters encouraging people to travel. You have posters encouraging, plays like Little Miss Muffet, go visit the zoo. You also have art classes for children, a theater production around Abraham Lincoln. There's also health screenings, and encouraging people to go to the doctor, to pay attention to their health. Um, because at this point in time, people just don't have the money in order to go to a doctor. So they need, um, this is all geared around trying to build awareness and to try and bring some sense of normalcy back to America. So in May 1936, the Rural Electrification Act is passed. And what this does is it creates cooperatives within the South with the goal of encouraging families within the rural areas of the South to get electricity and make it easier for them to access electricity. The problem was that the South was kind of bringing the entire nation down. And FDR targets the South specifically for that reason, that most of the rural areas in the South were desperately poor. And he wanted to bring them kind of out of the dark ages and then bring them into kind of a more modern society. And so he saw electricity as one of the ways in which to do this. In the 1930s, 3% of the rural farmhouses had power. By 1959, 90% had power. And that's pretty amazing. And so these local electric cooperatives would basically go out and encourage people to, turn their house on to electricity. And then it didn't stop just there. They would have examples of modern kitchens, as this picture in the middle demonstrates, and they would have home economists on staff that would do demonstrations about how you can cook with an electric stove, how you can use an electric mixer. In other words, they're trying to teach people how to use, not just get electricity, but also how to use it effectively. And one of the big things that they did was they would have cookbooks, and these home economists would go out and gather cookbooks or cookbook recipes from different people in the town, and it would encourage not just, it wasn't just to encourage good food, it was to encourage people to join the cooperative and to sign on for electricity. Okay. So the Wagner Act, this is passed. This is part of the National Labor Relations Act of 1935, which was called the Wagner Act, and it becomes one of the foundations of American labor law. It guarantees basic rights of private sector employees to organize into trade unions, engage in collective bargaining for better terms and working conditions, and take collective action, including striking if necessary. The biggest thing it does is it creates the National Labor Relations Board, and they oversee the process by which employees decide whether to be represented by a labor organization or not. And then it would also prosecute violations of the Wagner Act. You will notice that it does not apply to workers covered by the Railway Labor Act. That is because the railroads had their own unions that also had worked with upper management within the larger railroads and had kind of secured their own rights. And the railroads did not want anything to disturb the contract that they had between themselves and their workers. The law also does not apply to agricultural employees, domestic employees, supervisors, federal, state, or local government workers, and independent contractors. If you're looking for something out of that, think about the agricultural employees and domestic employees. This is a nod to the Democratic Party in the South. Agricultural employees could not unionize, and the South never, ever wanted them to unionize. And so FDR kind of goes along with this in order to make sure that his support from Southern Democrats does not waver. Also part of the Second New Deal is the Social Security Administration, and this is passed in August of 1935. The primary focus is aid for the elderly, the unemployed, and children. And so there are two provisions for old age security: federal aid to the states for cash pensions to their needy aged, and then there's the system of federal old age benefits for retired workers. And this was a preventative measure to avoid dependency in old age, so it would provide a lifetime income. Again, notice the exclusions: self-employed, agricultural, domestic workers, casual laborers, nonprofit employees, and those subject to the Railroad Retirement Act of 1935. So again, the railroad have their own benefits that have been set up, and they did not want government interference in any of those agreements that they had already created. Social Security, as we know it, it's a little bit different in 1935, but it hasn't changed too much. But Social Security came out of the Townsend Plan, and we'll talk a little bit about that, I think, in the next module. But this Social Security Administration is a reaction from widespread support of the Townsend Plan, which called for a pension for the elderly. And so we'll talk more about that later. So the election of 1936 is called the referendum on the New Deal, largely because of it's been long enough to see exactly how things were going to pan out. And overwhelmingly, FDR does extremely well. And so FDR feels like he's riding kind of a wave of invincibility. And so one of the things that comes out of the election of 1936 is that FDR has created kind of a coalition, or what we call the New Deal Coalition, made up of very, very interesting and diverse groups. So banking and oil industrialists are supporting him. Democratic State Party organizations, of course, are urban political machines, labor unions, blue-collar workers, minorities, especially African Americans, farmers, white Southerners, intellectuals, and people on relief. So all of these people are supporting the New Deal, and they form what we call the New Deal Coalition. It's interesting because, keep in mind, Democratic State Party organizations includes the South. So you have literally African Americans and Southerners who are supporting the New Deal Coalition. That's unusual. But FDR is able to maintain this coalition through some pretty heavy political pandering. There are some wins for African Americans, a few wins. I won't say there are a lot. But they, for the first time, really feel like a president is actually listening to them. And that's largely because of Eleanor Roosevelt. So FDR reaches out, I think I put it in here. Anyway, during a fireside chat, actually here it is, the bill was presented on February 5th, 1937. In a fireside chat on March 9th, 1937, Roosevelt kind of drops a bomb on the country. He tells them he is going to support a bill called the Judicial Procedures Reform Bill of 1937. And remember how the Supreme Court was basically, shooting down all of his New Deal programs. Well, this is his revenge. And he felt like, coming out of the election in 1936, that he had the support of the American people, and they wouldn't say boo about doing this. He was a little wrong, because it becomes kind of a public relations nightmare. But the bill basically would give the president an additional justice to the court up to a maximum of 6 for every justice over the age of 60 and a half. So, justices serve a lifetime term. So there were quite a few, I won't say, there were probably like maybe 2 or 3 justices that were on the court that were over 70 and a half. And so this gave FDR the opportunity to at least add 3 new justices, or however many it was. And while this bill is making its way through Congress, there are a number of cases challenging the constitutionality of the New Deal. And suddenly, all of a sudden, the justices start supporting the New Deal and ruling that it is constitutional. And so this is called the switch in time that saved 9. Basically, one of the justices begins to switch his vote from calling it unconstitutional to calling it constitutional. And so it kind of lets the steam out of what's pushing this judicial procedures reform bill. And so FDR's happy, and the Supreme Court's happy, and everybody just kind of lets it go. But this is a really great example of what we would call executive overreach. And there are cases where the president does this sometimes, and he always gets his hand slapped. And we can name a few of those cases, but this was the one for FDR. So some of the New Deal legacies, one of the things that FDR really encouraged within the WPA and a lot in Farm Security Administration, a lot of these organizations, was photography. And he wanted America to become aware of itself. And so he encouraged people who were visiting rural areas of the South and the West to take pictures, and then they would get those into magazines, into newspapers. And he called it Introducing America to Itself. And it was really only when people actually began to see the living conditions of some of the people in the South and in the West that they began to realize exactly how bad the Great Depression was and how much was really needed. And that is one of the legacies that's left, is the fact that we have this rich archive of photographs that these photographers took, depicting life during the Great Depression. So what kind of signals the end of the New Deal? You have the coalition forming of Southern Democrats and Northern Republicans, and they begin to block really any further reforms from taking place. Of course, by 1939, America is looking towards World War II. It's pretty obvious that at some point there's going to be a massive war with Germany, and really and truly that's what gets America out of the Great Depression. So we'll talk in the next module more about some of the reactions to the New Deal.